Every war that became a world war started the same way. A single decision, a single moment, a single action that nobody, in the room where it was made, believed would end the world. And yet it did. Right now, the United States military is considering seizing an Iranian island. Russia is providing Iran with military cooperation. China has warned of, and I am quoting directly, an uncontrollable war. And the Gulf states are running out of patience. This is not a prediction. This is a map, and every road on it leads to the same place. I'm going to walk you through 5 steps, 5 decisions, 5 moments, 5 points where the war in the Middle East stops being a regional conflict and becomes something that every person on this planet feels. You don't have to believe it's inevitable, but by the end of this, you won't be able to argue it's impossible. Let's establish where we are. It is late March 2026. The United States and Israel have been at war with Iran for nearly 4 weeks. Operation Epic Fury has struck over 7,800 targets inside Iran. Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei is dead. Iran's nuclear infrastructure has been heavily degraded, and yet, Iran has not surrendered, has not collapsed, has not stopped fighting. The Strait of Hormuz, the narrow choke point through which 20% of the world's oil supply passes every single day, has been largely blockaded by Iran. Oil prices have surged past $100 a barrel. The global economy is teetering. In Iraq, Iranian-backed militias have carried out over 300 drone and missile attacks since the war began. U.S. personnel have been killed at a Kuwaiti port. A hotel in Erbil housing American troops was hit by a drone swarm. The U.S. Embassy issued a Level 4 "Do Not Travel" order for all of Iraq. And now, the Trump administration is openly discussing options that would have been considered unthinkable 4 weeks ago. Seizing Kharg Island, deploying thousands of Marines to Iran's coastline, sending ground troops to secure Iran's enriched uranium stockpiles. Every one of those options carries a tripwire, and some of those tripwires are connected to things much bigger than Iran. To understand how this becomes a world war, you need to understand who is already in this conflict, and who isn't yet, but could be. The United States. Over 6,000 combat sorties, 7,800 targets struck, 13 service members dead. Carrier strike groups in the Arabian Sea, thousands of Marines being repositioned, the 82nd Airborne Division on standby, a military machine already running at high tempo, and a president considering escalating it further. Israel. Still striking Tehran as late as March 25th, still vowing to neutralize any Iranian attempt to reconstitute a nuclear program. Still making barely veiled threats against Iran's new supreme leader, operating with its own objectives, which do not always align with Washington's. Iran, battered, degraded, but not broken. Shifting to heavy 1-ton warheads, retaliating across the Gulf, controlling the Strait of Hormuz, and publicly claiming military cooperation with Russia and China. And now, Russia and China. Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov publicly accused Washington of undermining international law and pursuing a resource-driven agenda. Russia, according to multiple intelligence assessments, has been providing Iran with drone technology refinements, intelligence cooperation, and operational guidance. China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi demanded an immediate cessation of military operations. Beijing warned publicly that continued escalation could spiral into, quote, an uncontrollable regional conflict. China is Iran's largest oil customer. It has a 25-year economic cooperation agreement with Tehran signed in 2021. And it has every strategic reason to prevent the United States from establishing control over the Persian Gulf's energy architecture. These are not bystanders. These are actors, watching, calculating, waiting for their own tripwire. The U.S. seizes Kharg Island. Reuters confirmed in March 2026 that the Trump administration has discussed deploying U.S. troops to Iran's Kharg Island, the terminal that handles 90% of Iran's oil exports. The USS Boxer Amphibious Readiness Group, carrying approximately 4,500 Marines, has already been accelerated toward the Middle East. J.P. Morgan analysts issued a direct warning. A strike or seizure of Kharg would trigger severe Iranian retaliation across the Strait of Hormuz. Iran has already proven it can reach Kharg with missiles and drones. American troops on that island, sitting 21 miles off Iran's coastline, within range of hundreds of Iranian coastal missile batteries, would be the most exposed U.S. military force in any conflict since the Pacific theater of World War II. But here's the calculation Washington is making. Control Kharg Island, and you control Iran's economic lifeline. You hold leverage that no amount of bombing can create. You give Tehran a concrete reason to negotiate rather than fight. The problem is, seizing Kharg doesn't end the war. It starts the next phase of it. And that next phase is where Step 2 begins. Iran activates its full proxy network. Reuters reported in early March that Iran's proxy forces in Iraq had largely held back, waiting for orders that hadn't come. But a U.S. ground operation on Iranian soil would be the trigger those orders were waiting for. Kataib Hezbollah, Asaib al-Haq, the Houthis, Hezbollah in Lebanon. What remains of Iranian-aligned forces in Syria? All of them have been calibrated to activate simultaneously in exactly this scenario. The Irregular Warfare Institute published a direct assessment of this. Iran's proxy architecture was specifically designed to survive exactly this kind of decapitation strike. Designed to fight indefinitely, asymmetrically, and below the threshold of direct confrontation. A U.S. ground presence on Kharg Island is not below that threshold. It is the threshold. And once crossed, the proxy network doesn't hold back anymore. This is where the regional war becomes something else entirely. Step 3. The Gulf states enter the fight. CNBC reported on March 19th that Iran's Gulf neighbors, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, Bahrain, had said that the attacks on their energy infrastructure cannot go unanswered. Saudi Foreign Minister Faisal bin Farhan warned publicly that patience was limited. Iran struck Qatar's Ras Laffan LNG terminal, one of the most critical energy infrastructure nodes on the planet, in retaliation for Israeli strikes on Iran's South Pars gas field. Qatar is the world's largest exporter of liquefied natural gas. A sustained strike on Ras Laffan doesn't just hurt Qatar. It sends shockwaves through every economy on Earth that imports LNG. Europe, Japan, South Korea, India. When the Gulf states retaliate, and the Saudi foreign minister's language suggests they will, the conflict stops being a U.S.-Iran war with regional proxy dimensions. It becomes a multi-state war fought across the entire Persian Gulf. And a multi-state war across the Persian Gulf has one guaranteed casualty before a single additional shot is fired: the global energy supply. Oil at $100 a barrel becomes $150, then $200. The Strait of Hormuz, already partially blockaded, closes completely. Every economy on Earth that runs on oil, which is every economy on Earth, begins absorbing a shock for which no modern contingency plan exists. Step 4. Russia makes a move in Europe. Here is the connection that most analysts are treating as theoretical. It isn't. Every U.S. aircraft carrier in the Arabian Sea is a carrier not available in the North Atlantic. Every U.S. fighter sortie over Iran is a sortie not available to NATO partners. Every $1 billion burned in Operation Epic Fury is $1 billion not going to Ukraine's defense. Russia has been watching this calculation happen in real time. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky stated publicly that he had evidence Russia was aiding Iran with intelligence. Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov has been publicly undermining the U.S. legal justification for the war. And NATO scrambled jets in late March as Russia fired nearly 400 drones toward Ukraine, signaling what analysts described as preparations for a new spring offensive. If the United States is fully committed militarily in the Persian Gulf, with Marines on Kharg Island, carrier groups in the Arabian Sea, and thousands of additional troops in the region, the NATO deterrent in Europe becomes visibly thinner. And thin deterrents invite pressure. That's not speculation. That is how the Cold War almost became a hot one. Multiple times. But here is the step that nobody wants to say out loud, because saying it makes it real. Step 5 involves a word that the entire conflict has been carefully engineered to avoid, and that word is nuclear. The SecDev Escalation Risk Assessment, published on March 23, 2026, one of the most rigorous game-theoretic analyses of this conflict, placed the probability of broader regional conventional escalation at 45 to 50% over the next 3 to 6 months. It placed nuclear use at 1 to 3%. That sounds small. It is not small. A 1 to 3% probability of nuclear use in a live, active conflict involving the world's most powerful military and a country that has been publicly accused of pursuing nuclear weapons for decades is, historically speaking, terrifyingly high. Iran's enriched uranium stockpiles were not fully destroyed by Operation Epic Fury. U.S. officials have discussed ground operations specifically to secure that material. An admission that it still exists, is still accessible, and could potentially be reconstituted or weaponized. Iran's new supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, made his position clear on March 12. Iran will keep the Strait of Hormuz shut. It will avenge its martyrs. It will not stop. He did not mention nuclear weapons. He didn't have to. The threat is structural. It is embedded in the situation itself. Because here is the logic that no government publicly articulates, but every defense ministry privately models. If Iran concludes that the United States is committed to regime destruction, not just nuclear degradation, not just military pressure, but the actual end of the Islamic Republic, then the calculation about nuclear weapons changes completely. A regime fighting for its survival with nuclear material on hand and nothing left to lose is the single most dangerous actor in the history of modern warfare. And right now, the U.S. has not made its objectives clear enough to prevent that conclusion. The Indian Institute for Defense Studies and Analyses published a direct assessment on March 23, stating exactly this. One of the defining features of the current crisis has been a degree of confusion within the U.S. administration regarding its ultimate objectives. Confusion about objectives. Nuclear material on the table. A regime that has publicly refused to stop fighting. That combination is not a scenario. That is a condition. So map it out. U.S. Marines land on Kharg Island. Iran activates its full proxy network across 5 simultaneous fronts. The Gulf states retaliate against Iran's energy infrastructure. The Strait of Hormuz closes completely. Oil hits $200 a barrel. Europe faces a combined energy shock and NATO deterrence crisis as Russia pushes in Ukraine. China, which has 90% of its Iranian oil supply now under threat from a U.S. military operation, makes a decision about how far it is willing to let Washington restructure the Persian Gulf's energy architecture. China's decision is the one nobody has modeled publicly with enough specificity. Because China does not need to fire a single missile to fundamentally alter the outcome of this conflict. It can cut off semiconductor exports to U.S. allies. It can flood the bond market. It can signal support for Iranian sovereignty in ways that tie Washington's hands diplomatically. It can provide Tehran with satellite intelligence, the same satellite imagery that Russian intelligence used to expose U.S. strike plans before Operation Epic Fury even began. Each of those actions, individually, is below the threshold of direct military conflict. Collectively, they change the math of the war in ways that no amount of U.S. air power can compensate for. And somewhere in that sequence of individually below-threshold actions, the line between a regional war and a global confrontation stops being a line. It becomes a gradient, and you only realize you crossed it when you're already on the other side. 5 steps. A U.S. ground operation on Kharg Island. Full proxy network activation. Gulf state retaliation. Russian opportunism in Europe. China's calculation about the Persian Gulf energy architecture. None of these steps requires a single actor to decide they want a world war. That is the most important thing to understand about how world wars actually start. Nobody decides to start one. They decide to take the next step. The proportionate response, the justified retaliation, the strategic necessity, and the steps accumulate. Until one morning, a president or a prime minister or a general looks at a map of active fronts, ongoing strikes, ally obligations being triggered, and supply chains collapsing, and realizes that what started as a strike on a hotel in Erbil is no longer containable. The 82nd Airborne is on standby. The USS Boxer is in the water, carrying 4,500 Marines. Russia fired 400 drones at Ukraine last week. China told the world this conflict could become uncontrollable. And Trump is still saying, "We're winning." Maybe he's right, but every empire that sleepwalked into its worst war said the same thing, right up until the moment it wasn't true anymore.